So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Digital Innovation in Financial Services, the New Urgency Toward API Adoption and Digital Architectures. I'm Calvin Fudge, your moderator for today's webinar. And we're happy to have Forrester join with SmartBear to present this timely look at how banking and the financial services industry are adapting to the unique time in today's modern commerce. Our speakers for today are Joost Opperman, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester. Please change slide. Our speakers for today are Joost Opperman, and who is Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester, and Ali Insana, Senior Director of API Lifecycle Solutions at SmartBear. Just a couple of instructions before we get started. The session is being recorded, and an icon or archive viewing option will be available after the presentation. And if you have questions, there's a chat window located at the bottom of the screen. Put your questions in that and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So with that, I think we're ready to begin. Joost, please proceed.
Thank you, Calvin. And once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you're in, and certainly also when you will listen to the recording of this webinar. And first of all, thank you very much to SmartBear, because I really like the opportunity to talk about, on one side, digital banking architectures, and on the other side, how to drive change, how to basically push the necessary change forward when it comes to banking technology, banking architectures. So let me start with a certain look at the state of the industry. Let me start with talking about the top 6 business requirements driving change in financial services. And to do so, I would like to talk about survey data from Forrester's most recent Global Financial Services Architecture Survey, and certainly about a North American view here. When we look at the top 6 business requirements, we clearly see that there is a pretty solid picture. Customer experience, customer service remained center stage. Banks, financial service institutions focused on customer experience. And we are clearly seeing that related aspects, such as improving sales capabilities in line with great CX, and also reducing time to market, time to value, are also key aspects driving change. Why do I say that? Because, for example, customers are not happy anymore when, for example, an onboarding takes 20 days as opposed to the 2 or 3 days until a customer has been onboarded, until a card has arrived, that they would expect. That's certainly about innovative products and services, products that are better to create happy customers. It's certainly also about managing technology and application risk. And here is certainly some kind of conflict, because the old systems that push managing application risk so high on the list certainly create obstacles for innovative products and services. And then, very close to great customer experience, we're also seeing increased efficiency and productivity high on the list. I believe this is not only for bank internal processes, this is also relevant for processes that are customer facing, because we have to keep in mind customer experience is not only about glossy interfaces, it's definitely also about seamless, efficient, end-to-end digital processes. With that in mind, I have to say this survey data comes from a point in time prior to the ongoing pandemic. So consequently, there is certainly some impact, and we will look at the impact in a few minutes. Right now, I would like to talk about something entirely different. Are financial services firms ready for the future? Are they ready for the forces that some people say are tearing the industry apart? So let's again have a look at one of our survey questions. This was basically about whether banks, financial service institutions have the right technology infrastructure and banking applications in place to best serve their customers. And the response was 89%. Unfortunately, This was not 89% have everything in place. No, 89% believe they do not have all the infrastructure and applications in place to serve their customers in the best possible way. They think they need to improve. And just to mention that, in 4 to 5 years, the same survey tells us banks, financial service institutions expect to be in exactly a reverse situation when the vast majority believes they will be perfectly positioned to achieve this goal. Consequently, it is certainly not a huge surprise that 92% of financial services firms told us that they already work on transformation or they will start by the end of next year, the latest. I guess this could be some kind of positive news. However, there are some kind of considerations. When we look at the past decade, and for example, at the global perspective of the survey data, we are seeing that all the time, between 60 and 80%, plus minus a few percent, of institutions told us exactly the same thing. We are transforming, or we will start by the end of next year, the latest. This basically gives us room, space for a couple of interpretations. One of them is certainly a positive one. Financial services firms have accepted the need for continuous transformation. The future will not see a single transformation program anymore. The future will see multiple different smaller projects in line with the continuous transformation initiative, or maybe not even an initiative, just the typical way of doing business. However, at the same point in time, we are also seeing that many financial services firms are very reluctant to start transformation. They certainly see the risk of transformation. They see a couple of projects that were not 100% successful. And here the issue is that those projects that are not so successful, that are failures, are typically well positioned in the media, while those that are a success are not. But let's be very clear, transformation needs proper planning to be successful. It certainly needs experienced transformation teams. And some banks do not have these teams anymore, simply because the last transformation has been too long in the past. There's no documentation. All this creates some kind of uncertainty and certainly also reluctance to start transformation projects. So overall, I believe 92% is some good news, but certainly banks need to find a way to move forward and to de-risk their transformation journey, particularly when it comes to the complexity of existing banking application environments. So with that in mind, let's have a look at another set of survey data. Here we ask where institutions want to start their transformation initiatives, in which topic areas. And I have picked 7 initial points of transformation, and they are pretty much aligned, fortunately, with the business drivers. So we are talking about omnichannel digital engagements, as in customer experience. We are looking at origination, automation, again, experience, and also efficiency, customer relationship. But we also see analytics and business intelligence. I'm very glad to see this data point so high on the list, because I certainly believe that banks need to do more with the data they have. I believe the data treasure of banks is more or less a pretty much undiscovered treasure. Most interestingly, I think, is the fact that banks seem to focus very strongly on APIs. And I guess this is good news, because APIs are certainly a tool for flexibility, fostering flexibility. APIs are also a way to participate in banking ecosystems, in financial services ecosystems. So I guess this is good news. And given that it's so high on the list, that APIs are so high on the list, the question can certainly be, what are institutions investing? What do they plan to invest? So let's again have a couple of data points from our Global Financial Services Architecture Survey. What we are seeing here is certainly that, again, customer experience and omnichannel capabilities are the most relevant topic when it comes to institutions that invest now and plan to maintain or increase the investment, or do not yet invest but plan to start investing by the end of the year. So it's a very important topic here. Interestingly, the second most important topic are more or less two categories. One, again, data analytics to uncover the hidden treasure, but then it's again APIs. So the high interest in APIs gets reflected by plans to also invest in APIs. And no surprise, we are seeing efficiency and also some aspects of innovation coming in with a stronger focus on machine learning and deep learning, and also strong plans to invest in that space. So I promised to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has changed the situation. And let me first talk about three, let's call it archetypes. We could also say three categories of companies operating during the pandemic. When it comes to banks, we are seeing certainly a few banks, also other financial service institutions, in survival mode. Fortunately, these banks are certainly the minorities. This means they have seriously reduced budgets. They have to cope with the gaps that the pandemic has uncovered. For example, when it comes to digital processes that can help their customers to close gaps that came into existence because they can't access their bank branch anymore. This is about home working and systems that do not scale up properly and the like. So it's really about closing mandatory gaps. In the middle, we have institutions in adaptive mode. They certainly see reduced budgets, they have to reprioritize, but they certainly also work on a couple of forward-looking topics, as in more digital processes, better experiences, tools for home workers to improve collaboration. So it's really about some kind of reshuffling of existing initiatives. Here we are seeing capabilities that are accelerated. So this might be the case where so many people say, hey, the pandemic has achieved in 3 months what was formerly planned for 3 years. And I believe this is certainly true to some extent, because other things have certainly been reprioritized. And don't get me wrong here, these adaptive companies are also planning for the future. But even more so, we are seeing this when it comes to companies still in growth mode. Here we are seeing companies that do everything they wanted to do earlier on, but they also show even more aggressive plans to transform, to execute their transformation projects. Those who are not yet there, at least prepare so that they can accelerate after the pandemic, so that they can outpace their competitors in their geographies of operations. But what does it mean content-wise? Actually, there have been a couple of areas where we have seen essential improvement areas during the pandemic, simply because these were focal areas that were mandatory that banks had to cover because they needed to stay in business. We certainly saw the need for more resilient scalability of systems to cope with the unexpected sudden demand. And certainly, as we know, for example, some brokerage capabilities were not sufficiently scalable. It is about efficiency and productivity on the customer side to end digital processes, on the employee side, home working and tools to do so. So it's really about changing interactions and tools to support this new environment. And certainly we are seeing a strong focus on agility and flexibility, because banks are seeing that they need to cope with new business situations even faster than before. For example, when it comes to COVID-19 related loans. And I believe that you will see in a few seconds the poll appearing on your screen. And we would love to get your opinion. What are the areas that are more important for your institution today? And while we do so, let me proceed with my presentation. And I dare to say that the architectural design goals haven't changed that much. Maybe the priorities differ, but overall, I believe the architectural design goals, here are a couple of selected design goals, have certainly not changed fundamentally. We still need, and even as many great experiences as before, even more so to make up for the missing interactions in bank branches, for example. We need as much as before, and even more so, end-to-end processes and automation, so that employees and customers can work effectively with bank systems. And given the focus on architectural agility, or on innovation, on adding new capabilities, we certainly need the ability to embrace new applications, new architectural elements quickly. And we also need to do this in a way that allows us to support coexistence of old and new systems. I'm not sure whether I saw this correctly, but I believe this was exactly the topic with the most respondents that popped up a few seconds ago. Thank you for that. And indeed, agility and flexibility had 54%, so no surprise here. The question is certainly now, how can we tackle the topic? How can we create an environment where we have old solutions that have never been planned to work in today's environment, because these systems have been designed 10, 20 years ago in some cases. My favorite example, a 40-year-old assembler system, unfortunately got shut down some time ago. From my perspective, from the perspective of that bank, most likely not, unfortunately. But to go back to architectures and digital architectures particularly, so the question is, how can we create an environment where we can continue to work with old solutions while implementing new capabilities? So let's have a look at what Forrester calls digital banking platform architectures. And don't worry, I do not want to run through the entire set of details of digital banking platform architecture. However, if you are interested in some more detail, there are a few Forrester reports that will offer this additional detail. So let me give you an overview about digital banking platform architecture. So it's basically some kind of, in a nutshell, approach. Let's start with the banking entity layer. And here is where the business capabilities reside. This is basically about a microservice, a bundle of microservices, depending on your definition, representing a certain business domain, say a customer, say an account, or a deposit, depending on the way how you defined your domains. Such a kind of banking entity would access the related data via well-defined data APIs in the data maintenance layer. In the first step, the data maintenance layer has the only purpose, in the first step, to expose a stable set of data APIs to the banking entity layer. And it would allow access to short-term data stores. And the plural is definitely deliberate, because I believe that we certainly need to arrive at some microservices approach that does not use any kind of monolithic database underneath. This would basically be work against scalability. It would work against the notion of a true microservice. So we have one or two or many microservices representing domains. And we could combine these domains into sensible workflows within the aggregation layer. So that, for example, an account opening process would use a domain's customer and the domain or the banking entity account and a couple of others most likely, and combine them in a sensible workflow, a sensible business process. And don't get me wrong here, this is certainly not the only capability within the aggregation layer. We would certainly also manage the flow of events between different aspects of the solution within this layer. On top, we are clearly having the UX layer as part of the overarching engagement element, and where we would have support for mobile apps, for digital apps, for online apps, you name it. And we would also have a set of APIs. These APIs could be made available to, let's say, third-party developers creating a great mobile app for a given institution. They could be made available, for example, to corporates so that a bank can expose its banking capabilities and make them part of the internal business processes of a given corporate customer. So APIs are definitely a tool to make banking applications, to expose banking capabilities to the outside world. However, there are certainly also other aspects here, because we have to keep in mind that certainly banks can also work with other banks. So it's not only about customers, it's also about bank-to-bank relationships. So you may wonder why I used the blue color for these three layers. And this is because I see a strong separation between systems of engagement, the blue element, focusing on change, focusing on the engagement with all types of parties, and the green layers focusing on data, protecting data, ensuring that data remains consistent from a legal and from a technology perspective. And consequently, we called this layer with the data maintenance element and the short-term data stores a lean core, because we see not much more than accounts and basic accounting rules, consistency rules, while we call the two layers that represent the business capabilities, as in domains and aggregation, the digital core banking layer. With that, let's move one step forward. Let's have a look at how we can make coexistence happening. On the left side, we are seeing a traditional core banking solution, and you see one of the key trade-offs of a typical traditional core banking solution. It's a mixture of systems of engagement and systems of record indicated by blue and green. And this basically means we have some fundamentally different design goals within one solution. And this certainly creates challenges. And on top, we have middleware and channels. So it's basically a typical architecture that we have seen for a long time. The question is now, how can we make these things coexist? In the first step, we could expose, and this is one thing, one way, one approach that is possible most often, we could use functional APIs from the traditional core banking system and hook them in the aggregation layer. This would certainly work, but it would basically reduce the capabilities of the aggregation layer of the entire architecture to some kind of glorified middleware. So some banks found that their functional APIs are aligned with their domain definition, so they could hook their functional APIs in the banking entity layer, which worked in a better way. However, it made the applications more complex because they had to take care of synchronization in the entity layer as opposed to the data maintenance layer. So consequently, this is something that I, in the early days of the architecture, found to be an okay way for coexistence. Today, I think there's a better way. This is what I like to call data APIs. This basically means that a bank can expose data, again, including consistency rules and so on and so forth, via data APIs to the data maintenance layer. The data maintenance layer would then expose the capabilities to the banking entity layer. Again, using a stable set of data APIs. And don't get me wrong here, when I say stable, I do not mean that there's no versioning, but different story. So data APIs, and the data maintenance layer would also take care of replication in case that there is a short-term data store using similar data than the one available from the traditional core system. And if the data API allows that, the data maintenance layer would also send updated data back to the traditional core solution. And in most cases, this works. How can banks make these data APIs available? Some banks have access to the code of their core solution because they acquired the code, because it's a custom-built system. In this case, it's work effort, but it's doable. In other cases, if it's an off-the-shelf solution, vendors may be interested in implementing data APIs. Some cases, particularly when it comes to very old core solution, it was basically kind of an additional revenue stream for the vendors. However, it seems that the quality of these built-in data APIs get perceived in different ways. I've talked to two CTOs in two different banks, and one was entirely happy with the data APIs of a given core solution. I don't want to mention names. The other one said, no, we don't want to use this approach. We have to look for something different. The bottom line is data APIs do work, and they do work in reality. However, there's also another approach coming into existence. We call this replication. And when it comes to replication, in the early days, I thought it would be just some kind of bad workaround because it was basically about batch-based back-end replication. Today, the situation has changed. I'm seeing more and more both banks and also banking application vendors using streaming-based replication with software like Kafka to be when they use these software approaches to synchronize data between the traditional core and the short-term data stores. So overall, this works basically pretty smoothly. But how does this foster coexistence? I guess it becomes pretty clear. The next question is, how can we move away from the core? Because certainly it can't be the intention to live with 30-year-old technology forever. And what I've seen in reality is that as soon as banks have built or purchased the complete technology stack on the right side, have covered the entire functionality they need, including, for example, an off-the-shelf lean core solution, they can switch off the right side. That's the left side, my apologies. So this means it's not about some kind of rip and replace. It's a very continuous transformation approach that tries to go for as little change as possible, but as much incremental functionality as needed. With that, let's have a look at the next aspect here. And let's have a look at the next steps. Basically, even within this kind of more local approach of digital banking platform architecture, we certainly need tools to, on one side, manage APIs, different versions of APIs to support the entire governance, information about APIs. We certainly also need tooling to make sure that APIs do not get used in any kind of unwanted way. However, we certainly need to keep in mind that the banking industry, financial services, is evolving toward an API economy. This means a bank can, in a first step, be part of a banking ecosystem, and the banking ecosystem would certainly also drive a banking application ecosystem. This means a bank can, for example, combine its banking application landscape from various sources. In this case, we certainly need an even stronger focus on security as far as APIs are concerned. We certainly need to keep in mind that in such a kind of environment, it can become complex very quickly, because today we have plenty of API specifications in banking, but we do not yet have any kind of rich and broad set about supporting different versions of APIs, different flavors of APIs in such a kind of environment, depending on the position of the bank. And then you certainly have to keep in mind that it's also about mechanisms to track API usage, because such an ecosystem is not only about firm contracts, it's also about using APIs, because banks can certainly create micro revenue streams when it comes to third-party developers using bank capabilities within their mobile apps, when it comes to providing data to other third parties as far as customer contracts, customer relationships, regulation, etc., do allow that. So it's really about API infrastructure that allows to make the best out of these additional revenue streams that the API economy does allow us to use. So with that, let's have a quick look at a couple of examples that will also show us how the APIs will move beyond being some kind of local architectural element. Let's have a look at a couple of examples how banks have already used APIs in a strategic and in a more technical sense. So first example I would like to talk about is a leading bank in Asia Pacific. And they used, starting a couple of years ago, APIs to build their own cross-industry ecosystem. And don't get me wrong, they also went down the path of working with citizen developers, third-party developers. But for now, let's focus on the cross-industry ecosystem. For example, they made a couple of their banking capabilities, including credit scoring, mortgage origination, etc. Name these capabilities, part of a partnership with a real estate agency. So there was a tight coupling that created additional revenues on both sides, because the bank also basically linked their solutions and pointed their customers to the real estate company. They also did this in a couple of other areas, but the bottom line is the bank created an ecosystem with the bank in the center stage. So consequently, it has a lot of influence on the ecosystem. It could define APIs. It was basically a very comfortable position. My next example is not a leading bank. It's an emerging bank. To be frank, it's not even a bank today. It's an institution or a company still in the process of applying for a banking license. It's a neobank, and they are basically focusing on using APIs to foster agility to get the best possible application landscape. Early on in the process of determining the application landscape, they decided not to go for a best of suite offering. They did not go for one of the leading banking platform providers. They said they could not be sure that they would always get the best possible solution in each and every category, which is certainly true. So they went for a best of breed approach as opposed to best of suite, and they moved forward with an approach that basically builds on APIs. They use something like a combination of the UX layer and the aggregation layer, and they hook third-party business applications into this kind of framework layers. They use cloud-based capabilities from one vendor. They use partner applications for another business capability. So they really assemble their banking landscape using third-party capabilities in different sorts and flavors. So bottom line is this kind of not yet bank is really building on APIs to assemble their application landscape. They are using an approach that Forrester calls banking application ecosystems. In a more technical sense, we are also seeing merging banks working with APIs. For example, just recently I talked to a bank, or to not yet one bank, still two banks that want to not only merge their businesses, but they also want to merge the application landscapes, and to do so, to accelerate the transformation process or the rationalization process. And to de-risk the entire initiative, they created an API layer providing some kind of stable foundation during the transformation so that they could switch off one application and move the customer base of one bank to another application without continuous change of all kind of applications. So they were basically trying to reduce the number of moving parts. So a couple of examples here, more strategic, more tactical, and just keep in mind, please, that this is not yet the end game. We have to keep in mind that banks in the future will have various roles that they basically have to fill out. They may be in the center of an ecosystem, they may be close to the center, they may be at the periphery, and consequently, their influence as far as APIs are concerned will differ, and consequently, there's a huge need not only for APIs, but also for additional capabilities, managing this kind of complex ecosystem environment of the future easier to handle. And with that, I would like to say thank you and give the word over to Ariana.
Thank you, Jos. So while we're switching out the presentations, I want to draw your attention to our second survey question on deploying APIs. And we're sort of asking where people are focused to provide the greatest impact to your business using APIs. So in May of 2020, SmartBear ran the 2020 State of API survey. There were more than 3,000 participants. And of that 3,000, about 15% of them self-identified as being from the finance, insurance, or banking industries. So today, sort of in parallel to the reporting that Jos did, I'm going to talk a little bit about some insights from the report, and in particular, places where the industry, the banking and finance industry, deviates a little bit from the broader API community in some interesting ways. Next slide. So, May 2020. State of API was run several months into the new normal of remote work triggered by the COVID pandemic. A time of both deep uncertainty and also radical change prompted by necessity. In many industries, including banking, part of the accelerated change included in transforming a bank's traditional relationship with data. Even as the COVID crisis decimated the airline industry, United Airlines and American secured multi-billion-dollar loans by collateralizing their Mileage Plus or AAA Advantage customer loyalty programs, respectively. Third-party appraisals of their data suggested it was worth 2 to 3 times more than the market value of the company themselves, according to a study by Forbes. If the data from an airline mileage program is that valuable, imagine the wealth of data that banks and traditional financial institutions are sitting on. But if data is that valuable, then it stands to reason that APIs, which in many cases were built as an abstraction layer over that data, are key to harnessing that value. But APIs are not just focused on exploiting data. Also, and arguably more important, they help mitigate risk. In the earlier presentation, we saw how banks gradually are opening access to the traditional core via those APIs. Next slide. At the core of the story of APIs in banking is data and risk. And APIs are increasingly the pipelines into that mainframe hosted data lake, but they also unlock the value of data that companies have traditionally been sitting on. The number of internal APIs are innumerable. We know that there's approximately 30,000 open APIs that are sort of commercially out there and available. Next slide. But APIs are certainly not all alike. And one of the interesting things that we found in our survey is most teams are developing both internal and external APIs. But in the banking industry and financial services, internal only did edge slightly higher. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense because we're using APIs to interact with, in a de-risked sort of way, interact with the data model and the transactional information that the banks are privy to. Next slide. Before we can sort of talk about APIs, we really should talk about what's driving API development. And you can see in this chart, and the finance, banking, and insurance data slice is new. This is not in the overall report. That interoperability of systems was the biggest driver for all of our survey participants, about 64%, but 71% for banking and insurance. The second ranked driver for banking is extending the functionality of a product or service. There's almost a 10% difference from respondents overall, which I think speaks a lot to how do we use information about how you transact business with your credit card as a means of qualifying you for a mortgage. We've discovered that there's a lot of new uses that the data can be put to. Another example from one of our customers in this sort of layered model of API development is using APIs and data APIs to discover whether or not a transaction is a fraudulent transaction on your credit card. So we're seeing banks putting this, this work to use in new ways. And it's interesting because accelerating digital transformation, whether it's web, mobile, cloud, ranked 10% higher than for the overall respondents. So it's another key driver in banking, the transition from those traditional banking platforms, as described earlier, into the digital banking platforms. It's very important, and it's a journey, and it's a difficult one, and the stakes are quite high. Next slide. When consumers run into quality or performance issues with third-party APIs, their initial instinct is to report the problem and then to look at their other options. This is a general reaction, and in banking, there's a slight tendency towards more conservatism. They're slightly more likely to report a problem to a provider at 81%, but they're also willing to change. We have found overall that API consumers are less loyal, and that's partially a function of greater amount of choice and also partially a function of what APIs do to enable business. They really do provide an interface which makes switching from a content provider to content provider a lot easier. Now, people are inherently, I think, a little bit more likely to look back at things like their service agreements and stuff like that. It is a little bit more constant in banking than elsewhere, and that sort of translates to the value of the platforms that are provided. But it's worth noting that overall, the cost of switching for a API consumer is lower, and making your API easier to consume is an important aspect of how people derive value from the APIs in their ecosystem. Next slide. And part of the reason why switching is a little bit easier is API standardization. Companies are beginning to consider standardization as part of and parcel of delivering APIs out into the ecosystem. And even on banking platforms, APIs are beginning to achieve the same status as other products. And so the way that they're being treated, developed, and monitored within the institutions is changing. We only have to look as far as companies like Stripe to see that transformation take hold. But it also enables the digital platforms of standard discovery. And so it's putting the information out there for developer collaboration and for access and use of your APIs. Next slide. But standardization is a pretty big challenge. Overall, it's at the same level as, you know, the broader industry, but look at the change from 2016. Standardization really wasn't on the map as something that was desirable. The number of APIs out there was considerably smaller, but now we see that API standards, that proper versioning, have all become part of a company's API brand. We also can see that things like discoverability, which there really were not many avenues to pursue that in earlier days, now have become incredibly important overall in the ecosystem. From a finance, banking, and insurance perspective, one of the things that I thought was interesting is the emphasis on easier integration between tools. 37% for the overall survey respondents, but 40% for the financial services industry. And that's important because we're seeing that the challenge of mitigating risk, but also enabling access and distributing responsibility and even optimizing for some autonomy in a microservices architecture is an important part of why APIs provide value to our customers. Next slide. So a lot of the time when we talk with our financial services clients at SmartBear, they have what I've come to refer to as the layer cake model for their APIs for their services. At the base of the pyramid is sort of the mainframes, places long-term data storage and short-term data storage, similar to the diagram that Jos provided. And there are APIs that are responsible for currying data between those two layers. And if you think about it, at the bottom layer, any changes that occur to that broad information architecture have to be undertaken very thoughtfully and not very frequently. A layer above, we have process APIs. And these are responsible for delivering some different experiences for the customer. Even though they're internal, they're focused on elements like risk, for example, credit card fraud, or providing data into new product systems, like things that help qualify you for a mortgage or loan. And they're also working on de-risking the data by decoupling the knowledge of the customer systems from knowledge of a customer's transactions, so that in the event of an exposure, the entire game is not given up, and the exposure is not as high risk. It's also another layer of security. And then at the top of the pyramid, we have the experience APIs. And this is really what is connecting the data from this underlying system to customers. And for anyone who's sort of thinking, well, what do you mean by experience APIs? I'll ask the question, how many times in the past 6 months, perhaps, have you gone to a bank to cash a check versus taken a picture with your smartphone? These are paradigms which COVID crisis has absolutely expedited in the change. Next slide. So in order to transform from that traditional architecture, which did in fact lock up a lot of the value of that data, to the new digital architectures that are enabled in many ways by applications and APIs, one of the most important aspects is to ensure quality while adapting to change. This is sort of a broad scope vision of the API lifecycle. But I think there's a few things that are pretty important here in terms of how we can stage and deploy our APIs. Number one, the idea that as soon as a change is designed, if we have a lot of partners in our ecosystem, then virtualization is actually a really important way of sharing those changes and helping our partners adapt when there's circumstances that may require us making a breaking change to the API. Advanced sandboxes is something that a lot of banking customers have asked us for so that they can share that information with their partners, both internal and external. Once we get beyond the scope of building and adapting our APIs and our API definitions, it's also really important to make sure that the implementation doesn't create breaking changes. And there we have the different forms of contract testing to ensure that not only is the API accurate and in spec, and this is something that folks in the survey have been very clear about. They are tired of working with APIs that are poorly documented and where the documentation and the implementation don't match. And also, they're looking at the implementation details that are outside of a specification that yet could cause a breaking change. Changes to the definition of an object or the content of a message that would change the pagination or some rate limiting on the API. All of these potential breaking changes outside of the spec of an API can be captured in consumer-driven contract tests and the language of behavior-driven development. And then we're being forced into faster and faster development and delivery cycles. And we know that it's important to make sure that we can automate to the best of our ability. And therefore, we've seen a marked increase in tools that will work within the CI/CD pipeline, allowing tests to become the sort of final gating or passage before an API is made public. Next slide. In the end, and from the broader perspective of the industry, governance becomes a very important theme. And I wanted to end on the topic of governance because last week I was speaking at the API specification conference. There was a panel and it sort of turned to governance, and there was this sort of mixed love-hate relationship with it. No one sort of likes to feel governed on one hand. On the other hand, it does sort of help build a sense of safety when you're building your APIs. Governance is not always sort of a top-down initiative. In fact, in many cases, it's bottom-up, and those two approaches can converge. And there are certain times where it should be a simple guideline and other times where it should be strictly enforced. And a lot of that has to do with the type of data that you're presenting in your API. But in the end, I see API governance as about collaboration. It requires conversations among all of the stakeholders for an API. And it also provides an opportunity to have some of the decisions of API creation taken out of your hands so that you don't have to decide if you're going to use kebab case or snake case. That becomes an industry standard. The next decisions allow you to truly express your creativity in presenting and adapting data from the services that you're calling. Next slide. So governance develops from an understanding of a company's API strategy, but there are people, process, and tools that underpin all governance strategies. We're seeing a lot of new interest in API standards outside of OAS. More than 84% of specifications, both in the overall population and in banking, are written based on OAS specs, formerly known as Swagger. But there's an increased interest in two things. With the increase in the number of internal APIs, gRPC specifications have become very popular. I think 50% more popular in this year's survey than in previous years. And also asynchronous protocols, which if you think about the needs of microservices and traversing the boundaries of those, the domain-driven architecture, you can see how that has become important. So with that, I'm going to transition over to a Q&A and bring back our co-presenter, Jos Hopperman. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Calvin. I wanted to go ahead and mention that we have one question come through already for Yos. The telco industry through TM Forum has been working on a common set of open APIs for the industry widely, it's pretty much accepted protocol in telco. Is there a similar initiative in the banking industry?
I can probably take that if you like, Kevin. So to start with, I think there are plenty of initiatives in the banking industry, both on, let's say, the side of projects, organizations working on API specifications, and also on the side of regulators that for some defined scope and for some defined geography, say this is how an API should look like, or a set of APIs should look like. However, this already shows us a few things. One is there are plenty of organizations working on APIs for the banking industry. The second thing is that the banking industry is not, let me say, as homogeneous, if you want to say so, like the telco industry. There are many different flavors. There's private banking and retail consumer banking and corporate banking and the like. And what we are seeing right now is that we have a couple of organizations and APIs, sets of API specifications for the same area. For example, when it comes to what many people call open banking, as in exposing certain capabilities to the outside world. At the same time, it's also about the fact that due to this heterogeneity, we are not yet seeing a single complete set of API specifications. So there are always some gaps in between. And even if some space is decently well covered, let's use the set of specifications from the banking industry architecture, the network buy-in as an example. They have decently covered the retail consumer banking space. But at the same time, I think there are always gaps. I recently talked to some vendors that said, hey, if you look at certain open banking specifications, we still have to build something around that, because we can't one-to-one map the buy-in APIs to the specifications of local regulator X. So it's really about completeness and the ability to work with local constraints. And finally, so beyond that kind of issue of homogeneity and heterogeneity and breadth and depth, it's also about the word. It's also about the word standard per se, because from my view, a standard is something that got a stamp, if you would like me to say so, from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies in the US or from ISO, whatever. And this is nothing we have yet achieved, say, outside of a few, again, focused ISO standards. So overall, plenty of specifications, still a number of functional gaps when it comes to APIs, and certainly not yet what I would call an official standard. And certainly there are additional initiatives in the space then just one person. I was just reluctant to continue because one person just asked one question, another person asked, the attendee asked another question. So one person says there are, what flavors of open banking APIs are most of the banks using? Berlin Group, UK, open banking, etc., and more exists. Absolutely correct. So I can't tell you which APIs are used most, because Berlin Group is certainly very focused on the European PSD2 arena. UK open banking is certainly something that many institutions in the US simply have to use. So, and buy-in is something emerging. There's also the open banking project. There are plenty of other groups. There's a regulator in Singapore, you name it. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of heterogeneity here. Another person said, what's your opinion about buy-in? I think it's something that used a lot of time to arrive at the stage that it is today. Some of you may know that it basically started its work more than a decade ago, and I do not believe that the current state represents that many years. However, certainly over the last 2 years, they accelerated. At the same point in time, I'm not sure they are always focusing on what I would expect them to do. This is my personal view, obviously. Many others may see this differently. For example, when they start talking about callless banking and create pilot environments, this is nice. But at the same point in time, this kind of pilot, or to call a pilot callless banking, is kind of confusing, because within the pilot, there were core banking solutions. And at the same point in time, I have to say, I certainly like the pilot from a conceptual perspective, because it was basically one additional proof point for Forrester's digital banking platform architecture. So buying, in some areas, doing more than what I would expect them to do, looking at the initial charter. In other areas, probably not as advanced as I would like them to be after, I think, 10 or 12 years of work.
Thanks, Joost. Well, I think we're at time. We have one last poll that we're going to put out there. If you take a minute, it's just to kind of get your perspective on the kind of tools that you're currently using in your API development process. While we're taking the poll, I want to thank our presenters, Joost Opperman from Forrester and Aliana Insana from SmartBear. This recording, this webinar is being recorded, so you will have the opportunity for an on-demand viewing of this. In addition, we are providing a copy of one of Joost's most recent research reports on the kind of evolution of digital banking platform architectures. So just give a few more minutes for the poll to complete. I think we are looking at, looks like the highest is in the API design and documentation area, and then followed second by API functional testing. So I want to thank everyone and our participants for today's webinar. And with that, I think we will conclude the program. Thank you, everyone.